today is the 21st annual Afro-American History Conference that is to be held in Nashville, Tennessee. And we're talking to one of the founders of the show, Dr. Bobby Lovett. And of course, Dr. Bobby Lovett, before we stumble into this second segment, let's give you an opportunity during this second segment to talk about some of the experiences, some of the African-American experiences that would be appropriate because this will be part of our Afro-American History Month celebration. And so we want to make sure that we get that information. I think you've already indicated the interest in the African-American experience by a new generation. And one thing that we're reminded of is that more than 20 years ago, the United States was treated to an epic story of the institution of slavery and the African-American experience in what was known as Roots. And we understand that some of the radio stations and television stations are thinking in terms of revitalizing and bringing that information back. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the institution of slavery and how African-Americans were involved in that institution.
Right. Well, it's good that CBS and other stations are going to do Roots again. It's probably been about 20 years, almost a generation ago, that films like that were widespread across the country. And so there are many young people today that don't know very much about it. And of course, many of the youngsters that come to us in college are not very knowledgeable about American history, although it is required in their high schools. But something is happening in the teaching and learning of that topic that they are not well prepared about the American background, the American experience. But slavery, of course, started in the country in 1619 with the first 20 African Americans being brought aboard a Dutch vessel to the first colony that the English had settled, which is Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. And slavery grew from that until the Civil War around 1860, 1861, where there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.8 million African Americans, with 90% of them being slaves. In the state of Tennessee, about 275,000 persons were enslaved in the 1860 census. In Nashville, there was a large slave population, and slaves made up about, believe it or not, close to 26% of the population of Nashville. And free Negroes made up about 6% of the population of Nashville by 1860. What did they do? Well, in Middle Tennessee, for example, 10,000 slaves didn't work farms and plantations. They were what we call the iron slaves. They worked the iron mines from here to Dixon County and all the way to the plateau of Tennessee. And they smelted iron. They turned that iron into stoves, into pots and pans, into tools. They did all of the work. And some of the places where the foundries and the old mills existed can still be seen in parts of Middle Tennessee. So there were whole little towns where there were slaves who did nothing but work in the iron industry. They worked on the river boats from the Cumberland River all the way down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. So you couldn't go on a steamboat or a boat and not see slave and black workers on those particular boats. They built all the railroads in Middle Tennessee beginning in 1853 up until about 1860, 1861. Of course, they were farm laborers. You know, they worked on the plantations and farms. And in Middle Tennessee, we grew tobacco, corn, very little cotton, mostly livestock, you know, cattle, hogs, and things of that sort. A lot of corn. And so what the jobs that slaves did, of course, were all kinds of jobs. In the town of Nashville, of course, they were servants, they were cooks, they were, you know, house servants, and they did everything. But also, many of them were free. In Nashville, 22% of the African Americans were free by 1860, and they had a thriving business downtown. The top baker in town was African American.
Well,
the only ice cream shop.
The fact that they were free, exactly how do you deal with the fact of slaves free in a slave environment? Talk about that free element of the population.
Well, you know, Nashville had a large free black population because, one, they could buy their freedom. You know, a lot of them were very skilled. So if most blacksmiths were blacks. and they made a lot of money, and they kept a lot of the money, and they saved the money, and they offered their master the money for their freedom. They were coopers, that's people who made barrels. They were wagon makers. They were the majority shoemakers in Middle Tennessee. They were the majority bakers and cooks and so on. And the only pharmacy, or the most popular pharmacy in Nashville during slavery times, was operated by a slave. And they called him Jack the Root Doctor. And he had a shop on Church Street, paid his master part of the money because everybody went to Jack the Root Doctor when they got sick. He knew all the African herbs and all of the native herbs and roots and all of that, and that's what people use, concoctions, when they got sick, a cold, whooping cough, or whatever. And so Jack the Root Doctor made enough money in 1853, he was freed by his master because he paid his master so much money. So a lot of them purchased their freedom. Others were born free. If you were born of a mother that was free, you were classified as free, not a slave. And so all over the South, about 10% of African Americans were free. In Nashville and cities like this, it was a high percentage, about 22%. And they were 100% of the hack drivers. Hack driver is what we call a taxi driver today. They drove hacks to take people from one part of the town or the county or the other. They dominated that particular trade as well. They drove the freight wagons as well before the railroad days. And so some of them were stagecoach drivers. And so as a result, some of them had a lucrative business center in Nashville before slavery even ended, you know.
And so they were just an integral part of the economic development of Nashville and some cities in the South. They were just not a peripheral kind of situation. They were the integral part of the development.
Without African Americans and, of course, slaves, of course, the economy of the South couldn't operate because the economy of the South was based upon agricultural production. Cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, timber, tar, pitch, and hemp, which you made ropes out of, and all of that was produced by slave labor. And blacks made up about 34% of the South's population in that day and time. They're approaching that again now, where African Americans are approaching 1 out of every 3 Southerners again, as the out-migration to the north and the west has now stopped. And there's a lot of in-migration or re-migration of African Americans from the industrial and rust belts back into the South. So the population in the South of African Americans is going up fast again like it did in slavery.
Okay, and Dr. Love, let us stop for this second commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this short commercial break. Culture and History Conference.